Good morning, Land Skills Network. Ryan Fairbanks here, and we have with us Phillip Guerra. He's going to give us a presentation, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers about oil and gas versus solar. Phillip's been engaged in the solar community for the last little bit and successfully transitioned his oil and gas skills to use those for solar projects. So we'll turn some time over to Phillip to tell us about that and take some time for questions and answers at the end. Take it away, Phil.
Thanks, Ryan. I want to thank you and the Land Skills Network for having me today. I'm going to get to my background and everything at the end, just so we can get into this. I'm going to try to keep this to 35, 40 minutes or so, just depending on how quick we get through it. But bear with me and hold your questions to the end, and let's get going here. So, real quick disclaimer, I'm not an attorney and certainly not your attorney. Just, keep that in mind. These are all my opinions, not necessarily the opinions of my employer. I'll just leave it at that. But what I want to talk about today is oil and gas versus solar from a land perspective. Like Ryan said, I'm a landman. I still am a landman. I started out of law school, jumped in, got into oil and gas. Now I'm doing solar, and I wanted to walk you guys through today, what you need to know about solar, and from a 40,000 foot view, and comparing that to what you do on on a day-to-day in oil and gas. So let's get started with solar 101. There are two types of solar projects: behind the meter and front of the meter. A system that generates power or electricity that can be used on site without passing through a meter, that is behind the meter, or a BTM project. If a project is a system that generates, electricity, and that power goes off-site and passes through a meter before reaching you, the end user, that is called a front of the meter, or FTM project. So what I want to do is quickly go through some examples, and this should make sense to most of you. But again, behind the meter, you're thinking on site, it stays on site. Front of the meter, it goes off site. So here we have a residential rooftop project. I'm sure you guys have seen these before. This would be a good example of a behind the meter, or BTM project. The power stays on site and is powering that home. Floating solar, this would be another behind the meter project. Let's say that same homeowner has this lake in front of him. Instead of putting the panels on their roof, they can put them right there on the, in the lake or in the pond. So these are starting to become more and more popular. My favorite project, personally, my favorite project are these parking canopy projects. This could be a behind the meter or front of the meter. I believe this was a high school that we completed out in California somewhere. But if the power being generated from those solar panels, if it was powering the school behind it, that would be a behind the meter or BTM project. If the school was receiving a lease payment for that acre or two of panels on the in the parking lot, and the power was going off site, that would be a front of the meter or FTM project. Same thing, this parking garage, really cool concept. It's kind of add like a shading or a shaded parking area on the top level there. Most of the time, that's going to be a behind the meter project powering that parking garage, the power staying on site. I believe this was a Walmart or a Lowe's that we completed, your typical rooftop project. Again, if let's say this was a Walmart or a shopping center, and the Walmart was using that power generated from the roof for their own consumption, powering the store, that would be BTM or behind the meter. If they were getting lease payments and the power was going off site, again, that would be front of the meter or FTM. Here's your most common, and I like showing this photo for a couple of reasons. You can see that the panels there's a common misconception in solar that the land has to be completely flat. That's not necessarily true. These kind of bow a little bit. This is a project we did in New York, north of Albany. but this was a community solar project. So the power is being generated and going off site. So this is an FTM project. But let's say this farm had a big operations and they were using a bunch of electricity and the power stayed on site, that would be behind the meter, or BTM. Okay, so we were quickly discussing a large project in East Texas that, 10,000 plus acres. That would be a utility scale project, very large footprint. That power is being generated and going off-site. And that is a good example of a front of the meter, or FTM project. You're starting to see larger projects, utility scale projects being put in the water, floating solar. Pretty cool concept. They're kind of like a floating dock, or, just sit on the water, but another good example of a front of the meter project, or FTM. Last example for you guys, you can combine these. So here's a canopy and a rooftop. I believe this was a hotel. And again, if the hotel's using the power for themselves and it stays on site, that would be a behind the meter project. If the power is going off site and the hotel is receiving some type of revenue for that, that would be a front of the meter project. Okay, direct current, or DC, is what the panels produce, versus AC, your alternating current. That is what you use in your home. So when you power your cell phone, that's using alternating current, but it may have been direct current when it was produced from the panels, and we invert that from DC to AC. The electrical grid is typically AC. Being a land professional, I get asked all the time, well, how much is 1 megawatt of power? How many acres is that? We do everything in acreage. So roughly 5 to 8 acres equals 1 megawatt of power. And then 1,000 kilowatts equals 1 megawatt. What I like about my job, when I was in oil and gas in Southeast Ohio, I was in 5 or 6 counties, and I did that for 5 or 6 years. I was in one location. What's nice about solar is I can go out and get acreage, not only in different states, but I can acquire it in different ways. It could be ground mount or land. I can go out and lease a parking garage, a rooftop, or I haven't done a body of water yet. But my point is, every project's unique. Every project's different. Legislation may limit the size of a solar project. It's very important to keep in mind, especially when you get to the local level, very similar to building your pad site. You have to go through the township, maybe the county, or both, just to get a permit. It's like building a building. Everything's on the surface, so you gotta go through those hoops and the local legislation. And sometimes there may be a moratorium not permitting solar projects. So it's just something to be aware of. Okay, I'm going to quickly walk you guys through an example solar site, and I want to, walk you through a community solar site in New York. So a community solar project is an array of solar panels installed off-site. There's that key word. It's going to be a behind the meter project, or sorry, front of the meter project. It's going off-site. The landowner will be receiving a lease payment, very similar to oil and gas. But community solar, anybody in that area or in that electric utility can access the energy produced and receive credits on their bill every month. So for example, I live in an apartment in Columbus, Ohio. The landlord's not going to let me put solar panels up on my roof. It's just not going to happen. So if there was a community solar project 20 minutes, 30 minutes outside of Columbus, and as long as it was in the same utility territory, I could tie into that farm or into that solar project and save, 15, 20% on my electric bill every month. That's called community solar. And there's about 19 or 20 states across the country doing this right now. In New York, your land criteria for community solar, I'm looking for 10 acres or more. I want to be on or near a specific type of power line. I call that 3-phase power. And I need to be within 2 miles of the nearby substation. I also want to avoid wetlands, flood zones, excessive shading, from trees. and bad topography. We can typically do 7 to 10% slope or a grade. We try not to grade where we have to or where we need to. We rather avoid grading, period. But again, you'd be surprised at how the panels can roll. But again, you can't build these on a mountainside. It's just avoid the bad topography when you can. Okay, so let's say there's my substation. I need to be within 2 miles of my substation. So what I do next is I identify the 3-phase power lines. And you'll have to trust me here. Those pink lines represent 3-phase power. So we want to be on or near that. You're starting to see some of the properties, or farmland that might be a good site. 10 acres or more. I want to avoid wetlands and floodplains. So I have a layer in my GIS or Google Earth, showing that. So those green areas are wetlands or federal wetlands. We want to avoid those areas. And these are streams, those black lines, or creeks, rivers, whatever you want to call them. So we're going to avoid those as well. I know you don't know this, but from the, just looking at the surface owner here, I like to avoid governmental owned property. It's not that you can't lease a government, but you're going to have multiple decision makers. If I see the county owning a potential site, even though it's right across the street from the substation, arguably the best site, off of this substation, I'm still going to go try to find a different landowner just because I don't want to deal with the government. But you can go back and maybe try to strike a deal with them, and it would be the same thing. But so here's some good prospects. Number 3 would be out because of the wetlands. Number 1, like I said, I like to avoid governmental property, but 2, 4, 5, and 6, all within 2 miles. They're 10 acres or more, and they're on the right power lines. But this is how I go into a market all across the country. Every state's a little different, but that criteria for community solar doesn't really change. Every developer is different though. Some may say, look, we can be 3 miles away, or maybe some developers say, well, we want to be 1 mile. And the reason for that is if you have to upgrade the 3-phase power lines, the further distance away, it's going to become more and more expensive. So I try to stay within 2 miles, but some developers might be willing to take the risk to go 5 miles away. As long as the project can withstand those upgrade costs, it shouldn't be a problem. But like I said, every developer is a little different. Okay, so then once I've identified a site, we come up with, and I get the landowner on the phone, we come up with a conceptual drawing. This is, your typical engineering work. See if I can hopefully you guys can see my cursor here, but the solar panels or the arrays are going to be completely fenced off. That's what we call everything inside that black line, dotted line, is our buildable acreage. That's about 14 acres. In solar, and we're going to get to this in a minute, you are not leasing the entire parcel, which is in red. You are only leasing what's in black, or the panels themselves, plus whatever easement you have here. Very important distinction. Like I said, we're going to get into that in a minute, but this actually helps landowners make decisions a little faster, in my opinion, because they're going to see what it's going to look like, where it's going on the property. Can they access the other parts of the property? We talk access roads. Are they comfortable, with the, line and the poles going this close to this house or this barn or structure? You got to talk up these things through with the surface owner. So these conceptual layouts or drawings help that. At least they help me close deals all the time. Okay, things to remember. Find your substation, draw a 1 to 2 mile radius around that substation. You find the 3-phase power or electric lines for community solar. I like to be 10 acres or more. Avoid bad topography, trees, to limit that shading. And you also want to avoid wetlands, floodplains, bodies of water, and I like to avoid government-owned property. Okay, last section for you guys, and I know I'm going a little quick, but hopefully you guys are staying with me here. But this is the oil and gas versus solar. I want to get into what you do in oil and gas versus what the equivalent would be in solar. So in oil and gas, your operations are tied to the geology. You got the Marcellus Shale, the Bakken, the Utica, whatever it is, where the oil and gas is, you're tied to the geology. In solar, your operations are tied to the legislation. I cannot go into a state like Ohio that does not have community solar legislation in place and start building projects until that legislation passes. But a state like New York that's had it for 5-6 years now, that market's open. Solar, it's very important. Your operations are going to be tied to the legislation, whereas in oil and gas, you're tied to the geology. So highlighting that or fleshing that out a little more, these states on the left here, in blue, are going to be your oil and gas states for the most part, right? Again, you got your major shale plays in all of these states, including California. But that's because that's where the geology is, right? Again, oil and gas, think geology. And solar, in theory, I think there's a solar project, at least one project in every state. That's because the legislation's there, but there's different types of projects. As I showed you guys earlier, you can do utility scale, you can do community solar, you can put them up on your roof. The legislation has to be there in order for you to do specific types of projects. That's the big takeaway. Okay, in oil and gas, you acquire interest in a shale play. In solar, you're going to acquire interest in a utility territory. So I'm going to go to Ohio because that's where I was working for 5-6 years in oil and gas in Southeast Ohio. But for the most part, the oil and gas territory in Ohio are these 9 or 10 counties in the Southeast. In solar, looking at Ohio, every color here represents a different utility territory. So if I wanted to put something over here in Toledo, or even in Cleveland in pink or green, everything's broken out. Why we do that is every utility territory has different electric rates. The higher the electric rate, generally speaking, the higher the electric rate, the better the market. So you can kind of guess Cleveland, Cincinnati, Ohio, your major cities are going to be charging a little more for electric. You just have more people there. And generally those are better projects, but good luck finding a 20-30 acre site in downtown Cincinnati or Columbus. It's just not going to happen. That's why, when I say I can go out and lease rooftops or parking lots, that's exactly why we do those types of projects, because in the best market, it may be, a downtown area, and you're not going to find 20-30 acres of land. You're going to have to go and find other projects to do your solar, to do solar on. Okay, in oil and gas, you form a drilling unit. In solar, you tie into the substation. Again, sticking with Ohio, I was working in Monroe County, Ohio for a while. Here's your drilling units. That's not all of them. I just kind of drew up what it kind of looks like in one county in Ohio. But looking at solar, the equivalent, your drilling unit equivalent in solar is going to be your substation. Everything starts with the substation, just like everything starts with your drilling unit. Once you have your acreage, you form these drilling units and you get the well drilled. In solar, you can kind of see there's only there's only like 6 substations in Monroe County. So there's not that much potential for solar, maybe 1 or 2 projects per substation, depending on how large the substation is. Okay, wrapping this up here, a landman in oil and gas obviously negotiates a lease. You guys are well aware of that. In solar, a landman negotiates a lease option. I'm going to break this down a little bit for you guys. Let's say we have 10 acres. We're 10 acres in oil and gas, 10 acres for solar. In oil and gas, you're going to have a 5-year primary with a 5-year secondary term. And I don't know what market rates are, today, but let's just say you're paying $5,000 per net acre. You're going to be, as the bonus, that's due within 120 days, typically. You either drill the acreage or you release it. You can HBP an oil and gas lease, obviously. And lastly, it's unilateral termination, meaning once the landowner signs up, they're not getting out of it. The oil and gas company is free and clear to walk away. They could drill it, they could release it, whatever. In solar, you take the same 10 acres, you have a 2-year primary option with a 1-year secondary. So let's say 3 years. This is what I call an exploratory period. When a landowner signs up, it's not a guarantee that this project's going to go through. You have to get the project successfully through the interconnection study with the utility, and then you eventually have to get it permitted before you can do any type of construction. So that's what I call a 2 or 3 year exploratory period. A lease option, let's say $1,000 per calendar quarter. I mean, those rates vary vary by state, but it's not as expensive. Not as much money is due up front in solar as it is in oil and gas. Typically due within 30 to 60 days. You cannot HBP a solar option, at least not now. And very similar to oil and gas, unilateral termination. The solar developer, once a landowner signs up with them, they don't want to go and spend all this money on permitting, on talking to the utility. It could be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then the landowner refuses, to move forward with the project. Once they sign, they're all in, and only the developer can cancel. Okay, let's say the exploratory period goes well, you get through the utility, and the project successfully gets permitted. I now want to compare an oil and gas lease versus a solar lease. Again, 5-year primary, 5-year secondary, you got about 5,000 net acre. There's no escalator. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. It's paid monthly. Royalties typically are paid monthly. And again, you can HBP an oil and gas lease. In solar, I've seen terms as low as 20-year primary. Sometimes they're 30-year primary with a 5 or 10-year secondary term. So our leases at Forefront are generally 20 to 30 years. But I've heard of developers offering 30 to 40, just depends on the developer. In solar, you're going to pay by the buildable acre. Big difference there. In oil and gas, you pay by the net acre. That could be the whole parcel. It could be half the part, whatever they own. Versus the buildable acre, again, is only where the panels are going on the property. You're not paying the landowner for the entire parcel, unless you're using all of their service. What I like about solar is it offers a 1 to 2% escalator generally. Those lease payments, once the lease kicks in and the option's exercised, they sign the lease, those payments kick in, and $1,000 per acre will increase every year over the 20 to 30 years at 1 to 2%. You don't have an escalator in solar or in oil and gas. Typically, the royalties are obviously really good in the beginning, and then they kind of fade out over the 10, 20 years. In solar, it goes the opposite way. You start a little lower, and then it increases over time. We typically pay our lease payments quarterly or annually, just depends on what the landowner, wants. And then again, as of right now, you cannot HBP a solar lease. Last slide for you guys, key terms. Again, I don't have to explain many of these on the left, but in oil and gas, what's your royalty clause look like? Is it net, gross, market enhancement? Are there surface restriction clauses or depth restriction clause? Do you have a shut-in or a pew? Those are key terms typically in oil and gas. I know there's a lot more, but comparing those to solar, a lot of landowners want that rent escalator in there. That's very important to them. There is no royalty. It's just a per acre price plus the escalator typically. In a state like Pennsylvania, where we have a couple leases, or even in New York, there's oil and gas activity. A landowner willing to do solar wants to make sure that they put a mineral restriction clause in there. That makes sense. Access is a big thing for them. They don't want to be blocked to other parts of the property, so they want to make sure that they have an access clause in there allowing them to use the access road if we were to build one, and, you know, allowing them to get around the facility to whatever other part of the property they need to. Personally, I think the decommissioning clause or the decommissioning bond is the most important clause a developer could put into the lease paperwork. Imagine a developer going bankrupt in year 15 or 20 of a 30-year term. What happens to those panels if they're, you know, sitting on the property and you have no way to remove them? The landowner has no way to remove them. So a lot of times attorneys, you know, landowners, they're going to be asking those questions. And I think a decommissioning clause or bond addresses those. Most of the time, in order to get your permit from the city or the county, you know, you're going to have a decommissioning bond posted. But we like to put it in our paperwork just because if I was on the other side of the table, I would want that in my paperwork. Lastly, taxes. For the most part, a solar developer is going to pay not all the taxes. They'll pay any increase in the taxes due to the multi-million-dollar improvement on the property. If you can imagine a $4 or $5 million system going, it's like building a $4 or $5 million home. You bet your taxes are going to go up. So landowners want to see that the developer is going to be covering those. Okay, and that's, you know, like I said, I rushed through a little bit, guys, but that's all I had. Just a real quick story on me. You know, I got out of law school in 2013. I did not want to be an attorney. I was at a wedding actually, and my buddy came up to me and we were talking about, you know, what are you doing for work? I said nothing. 2 weeks later, you know, I was working for Intero Resources out of Denver. They were drilling and doing some work in Southeast Ohio. So I was working for their broker in Southeast Ohio. I did that for 3.5 years, running title, you know, drilling unit. I did curative, DOTO, I did everything. Then I realized I didn't have any negotiating experience. So I made the switch and joined another brokerage that was working for Rice Energy at the time in Ohio, which became EQT. And I did that for almost 2 years, or a little over 2 years. And then I got approached by a recruiter on LinkedIn asking me to take an interview. And I was frank with the recruiter and I said, I don't want to sell solar panels on, you know, for residential. It's just not what it's not what I do. And I'm glad I took the interview because I found out, as I was telling Ryan before you guys joined, the skill set, it's the same job almost I had in oil and gas. The skill sets are very, very similar. Yeah, you have to learn a little bit on the solar side, but I had to do the same thing with oil and gas. Even though I ran title for 3.5 years before I jumped into leasing, I still had to learn how to sell. There's still you got to learn how to do that. It's a completely, you guys should know that. But anyway, so then I've been working for Forefront now for a little over almost 2 years now, I guess. And I'm in 8 different states covering the East Coast. And I'm trying to help land professionals all across the country that are interested in learning or making a transition. That's why I'm here today. And if you guys have any questions for me, now's a good time to ask them.
Philip, I had a question. With you know how markets are cyclical in oil and gas and whatnot, is there a comparison in solar in terms of the market for land work? One of the reasons I asked that is so many people now are interested in the field that are in the stuff I do for AAPL. I've noticed that. And is there anything advice there you could give people that are independent and field oriented?
I'm trying to bring, I'm not saying the broker model, but I'm trying to bring, in solar, I'm the in-house landman now. I'm trying, like we have contractors. I'm hiring mostly oil and gas contractors because I know they know how to close. But to go to your question, in New York, that community solar program has been out for 6 years. So you're going to have it's more a mature market. So the land work's kind of on the downtrend, but Maine, Virginia, and Connecticut all within the last year and a half just opened up. So yes, there's plenty of work to go around. It's just that the developer you're working for or contracted with, or maybe you're independent, and you're just bringing deals to, someone like me at Forefront. There are, again, only 20 of the 50 states in the country right now with community solar. And that's just one type of project. That Texas project we were talking about, that's a utility scale project. And not every state has those yet either. That's where the utility is typically building those. So yeah, plenty of land work, to be honest with you. It just depends on what type of project you're doing. And I didn't even cover residential solar, which is, going house to house and trying to sell that. That's a whole nother avenue of work.
Thanks for that. Yep.
Yeah.
I had a few questions for you.
Sure.
As far as the lease, when you talked about the $1,000 per calendar quarter, is
Mhm.
that per acre, buildable acre, or is that per lease?
On the option side, when you're just you're basically paying them something to tie it up while we do our our exploratory period. No, that is not per acre. That is a flat payment. I used 1,000 an acre. It could be more than that, but we typically try to pay by the quarter. Some landowners like the first year all up front. You can work that through with the landowner, but it's not paid by the acre. It's just, let's say 10,000 for the agreement, or something, 5,000. It doesn't matter, whatever number you throw out there, but it's just by the year.
Right. And then in development, that goes to a per acre.
Once the option is exercised, yes, then you're paid by the per acre. Think of it as two different agreements. The option payment, it's a flat payment per year. And once the option's exercised, then it becomes a per acre price, just like in oil and gas. And my vision one day, I have a lot that I'm trying to work on, but I would like to see the solar industry move more towards oil and gas and just start with the lease. I don't know why. I walked into this, who am I, right? But I would like to see developers just start right with the lease, pay up front, a fee or two just for the 2 or 3 year exploratory period. And then that's when the lease payments would kick in. You still negotiate everything up front, but that way, I'm not saying there are holdouts, but imagine going through the whole option period, the exploratory period, you got the utility on board, you got the county or township on board, and then the landowner, oh, add this to the lease, or no, I don't want to sign it. It's just, I'd rather just start with the lease straight up signed, but we're working on that.
Makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Where is funding coming from for these kinds of projects? Is there a substantial government funding component? Is it private investors?
It's mostly tax equity, if as far as I'm concerned or aware of, but we're backed by a 40 or $50 billion company called Mitsui. Forefront is. So you can get your funding, from a hedge fund, or you got your own money as a developer. There's a lot of developers doing it different ways, but tax equity, if the four of us were, what do they call it? Accredited investors. You're making a certain amount a year or whatever, then you can tie into some of our portfolios across the country and get it, and invest that way. So we do take and we spread out the risk, so to say, and we'll fund our own projects, but we'll also take outside funding as well.
Okay. I got a couple more questions on the
Yeah.
money side of things, but Ben, do you have any questions for Phillip? Okay. As far as, I'm a business guy. I'm an independent contractor. And so I'm always trying to look at what's the profitability of that? How does that work out for solar projects? Because I've heard a lot of different things.
Sure. The term, as far as I understand, the term needs to be 20 to 30 years because the payback period's not as fast as oil and gas. I don't know how quickly, the oil and gas companies make their money back, but I would imagine it's a lot faster than, a solar developer. The developer, if you're going to take outside funding, from what I understand, the first couple of years, you're going to be paying those guys first. And then eventually you'll make your money back, but then you got to still, that's just to break even. And then you got to go the rest of the term just to get something out of it. These are longer term investments. They're not as lucrative as oil and gas, but they're more, from my experience in oil and gas, the oil and gas companies throw money around. They have a lot more money to play with. And then if they go bust, they go bust. But, when they hit it big, they hit it big. In solar, they're more, hey, let's go after this area, but let's be strategic about it. They got to work with the utilities. They know where the infrastructure already is, so they can place certain bets and not spend as much money. But if they do get some of these projects built, which, let's be honest, a landowner signs today, they got about a 20 to 30% chance. It's not a guarantee, especially with the utility. You just don't know how much power is going through that electric line or that substation until you get the study done. And upgrade costs could be north of $1 million, $2 million sometimes, and that'll kill a smaller project. But yeah, financing, I'm still learning as a land professional. I'm still learning a little bit more about that. I told you before we started, I actually work for a finance company. I'm just the land professional there. But from my understanding, yeah, the payoffs are not as lucrative as fast, if that makes, like, you're going to get paid a lot faster in oil and gas than you would in solar.
Mm-hmm. And then as far as participating in community projects, like if I was a residential owner, a business owner with proximity to a community project inside my substation area, how does that work for me to participate in that and be able to get the discount on my bill?
Yeah, most states that are doing community solar, you just need to be in the same utility territory. So it could be 100 miles away. It doesn't need to be within the 2 mile. You don't need to live within 2 miles of the substation to tie into the project. But in a state like New York, they do 60-40. So 60% of that power needs to go to residential, 40% needs to go to commercial. If you get a larger business, a manufacturing plant, or a Google or Amazon to tie in, they're going to take up all of the commercial side pretty quickly. But on the residential side, what we'll do is we'll either internally or hire somebody to send out letters to get people to sign up. All you got to do is it depends on the state, but you'll get a letter in the mail typically. And if you want to take part of the program, I believe you just sign up, fill out the application, whatever it is. And then once the system's turned online, you'll just receive a credit on your bill, every month for whatever percentage that, let's just say 10% at the minimum, or at the minimum, but I've heard it as high as 15 or 20, just depends on the market.
Okay. So just being a resident within that territory allows you to apply, but there's not an extra fee or anything like that to participate in the project.
No, in theory, I've been criticism there as well. The electric companies or the utilities will just raise their rates, and they can't just do that willy-nilly. They gotta, go through their certain channels and get that approved. But no, it should not cost the landowner anything. And in some markets like New Jersey, and I think going back to New York, they offer low LMI. There's an LMI component, lower medium income families. So like if people can't afford solar, like I wouldn't, like, again, going back to me in this apartment, I can't put solar up on my roof. Could I afford it? Maybe with the right terms, but there's some people out there that are barely getting by. And some states have said, hey, let's help them out. And they just got to provide, you know, their information, and they can tie into these farms, and it's a good savings for them. So there are good components there, but that's where the credits come in and the incentives, going back to your first question with the state level. Most of the time, like New York, New Jersey, Maine, Virginia, there's going to be some type of state incentive to do that type of stuff. That's why everybody's flocking in. When these markets open up, it literally is a land rush. It feels like 2012, 2013 in oil and gas. Just everybody leasing up everything, and then placing their bets.
Okay, I think that's pretty much covers my questions. More on the professional side anyway. Glad to have you with us, Phillip. Thanks for sharing, and always eager to get to know more about Landman and your career experience, but also to know you on a personal level, you know, what's going on with your family. And, you know, your wife's, you said she's in a doctorate program.
Yeah, she's doing her PhD in public policy here at Ohio State in Columbus, Ohio. So we'll be here for the next couple of years. I was telling Ryan, you know, thanks again for having me. You know, the Land Skills Network. I'd like to be a part of this. I want to contribute. Other presentations I'm working on for 2021, oil and gas for solar, negotiating a lease. I want to break down more terms and get into the weeds, so to say, on that. There's a lot of professionals that haven't seen a solar lease or an option, so I want to help there. And then I'm working on a couple other presentations, as we talked about before we started here. So anything I can do to help you guys, feel free to email me. If you call me, I get so many. I've had 2 or 3 calls just sitting here from landowners. I'm pretty busy, but any way I can help you guys, you know, learn more, try to get into this industry, let me know.
Okay, what's the best email for people to reach at?
Let's do. I'm sorry, I didn't even put that on the question slide. Here, I can type it in the chat there. Let's do my work email, pguerra@forefrontpower.com. And you can reach out to me on LinkedIn too. I'm sorry, I thought usually the Q&A slide has my contact information. I guess it didn't.
Okay, great. I'll get this rendered and posted to our Land Skills Network, and look forward to having you interact there. Ryan and Ben, thanks for joining us. Glad to have you with us this morning. And Ryan, thanks for your questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good day.